Perfect.
Well, James, wonderful to see you as ever.
Yeah.
In the depths of Somerset, AB.
Very good to see you, surrounded by foliage.
By foliage, yeah. So it's really about the origin of carbon, I think, and where it's gone and where it can go. So just back to the first ever carbon trade, which was in 1988 for Maureen, who ran the Castle Kerry pet shop, and she's her trees are about 15 miles from here. But that's how it all got going. And I remember we met, I think when you were doing the small island state work and that evolved into the Kyoto Protocol.
Yes, eventually. I mean, we first started working on the international law related to climate change around that time. I wrote an opinion for Greenpeace on state responsibility for climate change and whether the small island states, who then weren't organized in any kind of group, could take the United States of America to the International Court of Justice for failure to act on climate change, 1988. And I wrote that opinion, and then my advice was, they won't submit to jurisdiction, but these principles work. I've read the evidence. I've seen the connection between the law and the evidence, and I think an international treaty on climate change would be the best approach for you to argue for. And then we as in the Centre for International Environmental Law, which I helped to found, and colleagues, we built the coalition that became the Alliance of Small Island States. And then we negotiated the Framework Convention in '92, and then eventually the Kyoto Protocol. And in that period, between '92 and '97, were the beginnings of the carbon market, the idea of pricing carbon.
Well, that was it. And that's how we met. And I'd come up with this idea of planting trees. And Maureen, I remember thinking, I just read in 1988, I'd read the report from Hanson's NASA report saying how problematic this was going to be. So I thought, well, trees eat CO2 and change it into oxygen and wood. I was recovering from a serious car accident, actually. I was sitting in a willow tree for a long time, and I had time to think. But I was walking my dog into Castle Kerry, and I thought, well, Maureen, she's got a business, and I'll see if I could sequester her carbon. So she said, "Here, how much is that going to cost me then, Daniel?" And so I said, "Well, give me £3." And so she gave me £3. I massively overplanted, and I planted all around. The very first ever carbon forest, which I've got a map of here, is at the Castle Kerry Primary School. And then we planted up down the Castle Kerry Railway path. And carbon sequestration was a hell of a bad name. So that's when I was walking with Rima Sams, Craig Sam's daughter, who's joining, and I said, I've neutralized Maureen's carbon, and we were sort of throwing back phrases, it's just carbon that, and then out of our conversation came carbon neutral, and that's how that started. And then what I've really enjoyed with our first business relationship was when I came to see
when I was counsel to Baker McKenzie and setting up that specialist practice, the first specialist practice in a law firm. I was a barrister. I didn't come from the law firm world, but I was used to using the law in order to achieve a positive outcome for the environment. And it was good to be able to work with a big organization like that and build a specialist team. And one of the things we were able to do is to give advice to folk like you who wanted to, contract around the valuation of carbon in natural systems. And you did that very early on.
Well, that was a wonderful thing. And I think the key people in my life being primary, and also Dr. Richard Tipper, who was Edinburgh Centre for Carbon Management. He came up with the methodology of carbon sequestration per hectare. I was just on, let's plant some trees. And then you came up with the legal framework and the application and the systems. And suddenly I've got like brains of this caliber are able to help us develop this initiative. And it was very exciting, but nobody went for it in the very early days. And then there was that wonderful moment backstage at Glastonbury Festival, like years after Maureen and the first trees, where Michael Eavis let me in and gave me passes. And he said, and I met Joe Strummer, and I said, Joe, you could become the world's first carbon neutral citizen. He punched the air and said, let's do it. And then from that moment, that's how all the carbon movement got going. Is it populates with the culture? The best way to change culture is to use culture. So Joe Strummer was first, and then the Foo Fighters, then Massive Attack, then the Rolling Stones, then Pink Floyd, and it grew and it grew and it grew. And I think those early days of the happiness and the joy of planting the trees for the, and it wasn't because they were celebrity, it was more because they were opinion formers who were doing good by being good. So it was very credible at the get-go, don't you think?
For sure. I mean, obviously, there's more than one way to value a tree, a forest, a woodland, a natural environment. It's not all about the money, obviously. But if you don't give it an economic value in an economic system that values other things more than the natural system, you lose. Eventually, you just lose in the economic calculus. And one of the attractions of these carbon pricing markets is that you are able to equalize, you're able to sort of challenge the assumption that the trees were economically worth less, or that the natural environment was never going to be worth as much as something else that had economic value. And you knew from the start a very important idea that planting trees, the right trees in the right place, not any old tree anywhere, sequesters carbon, stores it for a long time if you keep them there, and therefore creates value in that natural system, in that life.
Well, I think that's it. And Richard, I think what we did with we came up with a methodology which was permanence, therefore a 99-year contract.
Yeah.
Species diversity, force majeure if the road
in cases of fire or something, yeah, or
whatever, force majeure, and public access. But the most important thing was permanence. Well, they're all important. Yep. Permanence, because it takes 50 years, as we all know, for CO2 to be at its most rate of forcing, and then another 50 years to get reabsorbed. So
and you've got to get deep into the soil too, as you know. Yeah.
As long as you've got the forest there for a minimum of 100 years, you're in sync with the climate check, with the carbon cycle, and that's really important, because what we then went on to see, I think, was the anti-offset people became anti-tree, because the first offsets were trees. And frankly, a lot of the anti-offset people, I would be there with them, because they're absolutely right. You can't offset carbon and then carry on polluting as normal. And this
that's why the word was so frustrating, wasn't it? Because why it got stuck, I don't know, because it's not really an offset. What you're trying to do is value the natural systems in this case, or the other ways in which carbon is reduced. Because you value carbon, you don't waste it. Atmospheric pollution from carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases is waste, right? You want to use the carbon productively, either in industrial processes or in living systems, but you've got to establish some kind of methodology that we did do that. And unfortunately, those who attacked it basically occupied the same territory as those who didn't want to value carbon at all, or at least knew they could play the political game. Well, let's talk about taxes, but they knew damn well they'd never get a price for carbon that would ever hurt their business, certainly not 25 years ago.
Well, it was extraordinary to have the ultra-right wing of the oil company marry up with the ultra-left wing of the anti-capitalist movement, and both attacking offsets.
Making the same argument.
And actually, it's in the semantics. We got the name wrong, basically. Yeah. Offset and carbon neutral. Neutral suggests you've got to a state where you have
exactly.
And an offset is like an absolution from.
It's like an absolution, and it's not that. The concept is not that, and it's definitely not that now. Now, where you started is where we've arrived at, which is you've got to remove carbon from the atmosphere. Removals. You've got to value the work done to create the emission reduction or the increased resilience or whatever other public good is associated with protecting and enhancing the value of nature. Those things are all contemporary understandings of how the real world is.
Well, you were right. Yeah. With Extinction Rebellion and some of the ideas of, which is very negative in terms of its die-ins and all that sort of stuff. So obviously, we're looking at positive rather than negative. But the climate anxiety that young mothers have about bringing children into the world, and the reports of extinction events are so alarming. And the biodiversity solution of what we came up with all those years ago has a real, you create wildlife corridors, you create habitat for species. And this is a very important thing, is to value biodiversity as a
You can bring the two together. You can bring valuing natural systems for their variety of sources of value, because, you know, it's not just the carbon, it's the diversity itself, it's the water management, it's the beauty and the amenity that comes from having access to the natural world, which we know improves our mental health and our well-being. All of those things can be combined.
It's been a fascinating journey, and then from the initial get-go and the big success with all that movement of big opinion formers, and then we got the Hollywood mob, and then I think my business, the first one I founded, it was over 250 blue chips we worked with, and the chairman of Mazda called me and said, I want to go carbon neutral because the Rolling Stones have. And that built out a really interesting arena. And but then we have the issues of the failure of the CDM system and the reputational issues around carbon, which I think a lot of people got a bit of a zeitgeist for, and they understand that it's not got a good reputation, but they don't quite understand why.
Yeah, it's true. And unfortunately, the CDM was a fundamentally good idea. It was a bargain between developed and developing world. We'll move money and technology to you. We will reduce the cost of our own compliance. The northern and western world, the so-called developed countries, had obligations that developing countries did not. It was a genuine bargain. And I negotiated that bargain on behalf of the small island states in the interests of those who needed the problem solved as fast as humanly possible. However, new structures, new systems have to build institutions very rapidly in order to be fair, in order to build proper accountability. And a marketplace is always going to be an experimental place for people to try things on for good reason. But we didn't build robust enough institutions to avoid mistakes being made, and the system couldn't cope with a very dramatic decline in industrial output in Europe during a financial and economic crisis. And the politics of it all meant that people were literally over-allocated allowances, and the system ultimately failed. But the idea is good and can be made better with better instruments.
And I think that's where we've got the opportunity now, is to go again and to refresh. And this is what's so exciting about where we are now, James, is we're using our 30-odd, 40 years of IP within this market in order to come up with fresh solutions.
Of learning from mistakes as well.
And you know, we've all made them. I've made some terrible mistakes on the route, but it's what you do to learn. You learn more from your mistakes sometimes than your successes. But I think there is a big opportunity to create forestry, biodiverse forestry, new natural forestry at a scale. And it's not a panacea, it's not a golden bullet. No. It's maybe 20% of the solution, along with all the other things we can do.
Along with all the others, but it's a very important contribution, and we'll get it right this time.
Absolutely. Well, lovely to see you, James.
Yeah, lovely to see you too. Take care.
Take care. Thank you.